A small town police officer investigates a string of murders as the dead return to live seemingly normal lives again. Sound cool? Good, because I'm here to talk about the 1981 classic Dead and Buried. Ah, yes, yet another fan favorite horror film that took me forever to get to. I picked up the DVD like, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and only just recently watched it for the first time. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've probably known about it for a decade, maybe more. It's over 40 years old at this point, and if you're watching this, I bet you've probably known about it way longer. It's quite the cult classic at this point. And it's always interesting to know about a movie for a long time before you actually watch it, especially one with a reputation and a lot of history. It's like you hear certain things about it and your brain just kind of pieces the rest together. Maybe you jump to conclusions, and sometimes when you finally see the thing, you're wrong about like a bunch of different parts. Well, that is exactly the case with Dead and Buried, for me at least. So, the main reason I was interested in seeing this and what put it on my radar were because of the two guys that wrote the screenplay. I'm talking about Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett, the two men responsible for the Alien screenplay, and story. Yeah, that Alien. I mean, both of those guys have done a bunch of stuff. Great stuff, in fact, but I'm a massive, massive Alien fan. I just love it, and I always will. Every time I watch it, I'm blown away by how it still feels so fresh to me. It still terrifies me, it still makes me feel claustrophobic and uneasy. And I know an equal amount of credit goes to people like Ridley Scott, H.R. Geiger, Sigourney Weaver, and more. But Dan and Ronald wrote it, forever sealing their legacies as legends and gods among men. But we aren't here to talk about Alien, even though I totally just did. Dead and Buried was directed by Gary Sherman, who started his filmmaking career in the mid-60s, making him a veteran filmmaker by 1981. He's done some TV series, Poltergeist 3, but to serious horror fans, this is his magnum opus, his claim to fame. It's also important to mention that the legend himself, Stan Winston, was the makeup effects designer here. The effects aren't quite as good as the stuff that Winston was more responsible for, but he still had a hand in this, and anything he's involved with will warrant a mandatory watch from us horror freaks. Oh, and you also get a pre-Freddy Krueger Robert Englund playing a character here, so yeah, I mean, a lot of horror royalty involved. Now, for years now, I assumed this was some sort of a zombie film, and it really kind of isn't. I guess you could say it's like zombie adjacent. And after watching it, I was kind of relieved that it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill zombie film. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love zombie films as much as the next person, but we have plenty of those already. So you have people being killed here, and they do come back to life, but not because of a virus or anything like that. And they come back as a completely normal-looking and acting, people, very unzombie-like. At least that's your perception through the first 90% of the film. I guess the ending, the way the ending unfolds, I guess it is maybe a little bit more zombie-like. I don't want to spoil anything. If you've seen it, I mean, you know what I mean. If not, just watch it. You'll love it. Getting to the story now, the beginning shows a traveling photographer taking pictures at a beach near a small town called Potter's Bluff. A very attractive woman approaches him, making small talk for a few minutes before seducing him. The first few minutes of this film had me thinking I was watching like softcore porn. I mean, which definitely made me chuckle a little bit. And I asked myself out loud, like, this isn't fair. How come this kind of thing never happens to me? Well, I mean, I'm okay with it because out of nowhere, the dude is attacked by a bunch of people. I mean, they're like punching him, kicking him, hitting him with shit. It's a pretty brutal scene. Then they throw a net around him and they set the poor guy on fire, and your jaw kind of drops. You're sitting there like, what the fuck just happened and why? He ends up somehow living, and you get Officer Dan Gillis starting his investigation. It's a small town and this kind of thing just never happens. And as he's, doing his best to find whoever's responsible for this, more murders start happening around town. He does his best, despite having no leads whatsoever. He has no idea what to do, and to make it more weird, all the victims seem to be people passing through town. Like a lot of 80s films, you get a tight hour and 34-minute runtime and generally good pacing. There's plenty of violence and gore to satisfy, the gorehounds like me. In fact, it's even more brutal than I originally expected. With a $5 to $6 million budget somewhere in there, it reportedly, from the research I did, only made around 216,000 in box office sales. Those are some horrendous numbers. Oh, and I also need to add here that despite me praising him, and despite him being worthy of praise, Dan O'Bannon actually didn't do any of the writing here. Now, he did write a little bit in order to help Ronald Shusett, who ended up not using any of O'Bannon's contributions, but his name, for some reason to this day, is still attached to the film. Ouch. I guess it wasn't very good. Also, I mentioned the gore scenes, and I wanted to add that the makeup effects really reminded me of some of the older Italian gore films around, from around this time, for whatever that's worth. I also get like older horror movie vibes, like 50s and 60s, kind of those vibes, but a little bit more modern, a little more 80s, and a little more brutal. But those kind of old school vibes, even for 1981, made this a really cool, kind of a special treat. I had a really good time with this. I'm not sure that I'll be categorizing this as a zombie film like some people do, but the zombie fans will no doubt enjoy it. I sure did. I'd actually recommend it to any and all horror fans, especially if you're into the gore stuff. I'm going to give Dead and Buried a 6.5 out of 10. It's got a somewhat unique storyline, even though it draws quite a bit from like the voodoo type zombie stuff from back in the day. The other elements are sort of original though, and this is a fun one. Cheers, guys.